Week 5 explores urban agriculture, food sovereignty, and storytelling with Jade Guthrie.
So Jade, a little bit more about our class. This is a community leadership class here in Regent Park. And every week we have a different guest speaker, a combination of practitioners, activists, and academics talking about different community issues. So we're really lucky to have you here today to talk about food sovereignty. And as part of this 10-week course, all of the students who are mostly residents of Regent Park or work in the area, they have to come up with some sort of community leadership project. And the project can be like a social media campaign, an op-ed, organizing an event, something like that.
Cool.
So all of the information that you provide us with will be really helpful in formulating the project. So I'm going to officially introduce Jade, is it Guthrie?
It is Guthrie.
Guthrie, officially introduce Jade Guthrie, and then I'll have you all around go and quickly say your names. So we're very lucky to have Jade Guthrie here with us. Jade is a queer, mixed-race food justice educator at Foodshare Toronto and community organizer with Justice for Migrant Workers, Black Food Sovereignty Action Plan Advisory Circle. She believes in the power of food as a meeting point, as a tool that creates spaces for people to come together. Her approach to food systems learning is shaped by intersectional feminism, anti-racism, and anti-colonial pedagogies, and is fueled by joy and liberation. With Jamaican, Chinese, mixed European, and Mi'kmaq, is that correct? Mi'kmaq roots, Jay's food justice work is shaped by familial histories of farming, trapping, and cooking. She is working on building meaningful relationships with food, community, and land. She is also an avid baker, wannabe sommelier, and reality TV fanatic.
Great. Okay. So hello, everyone. I'm going to start today off with a land acknowledgement. I'm sure you've done one in the past in this space, but I'm going to read the one that we read at the beginning of every Foodshare event, because I want to kind of link it into what I'm going to be talking about today. So Foodshare acknowledges that the sacred land in which we operate is situated upon the traditional territories of the Wendat, Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabeg, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. This territory is covered by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement between the Anishinaabeg and Haudenosaunee allied nations to peaceably share and care for the lands around the Great Lakes. Foodshare recognizes the many nations of Indigenous people who presently live on this land, those who have spent time here, and the ancestors who have hunted and gathered on this land, known as Turtle Island. Foodshare recognizes and supports the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and the Truth and Reconciliation calls to action as we work to apply both to our work. Foodshare also acknowledges the many people of African descent who are not settlers, but whose ancestors were forcibly displaced as part of the transatlantic slave trade, brought against their will, and made to work on these lands. Despite the ongoing violence inflicted on Indigenous peoples and Black Canadians, Foodshare is grateful for the care and contributions made to the land by Indigenous land and water defenders and Black food growers and farmers. We believe that advancing Indigenous sovereignty is deeply and inextricably linked to Black liberation, and we remain committed to advancing both. So I encourage everyone to take a moment to reflect on the land acknowledgement. I know we hear them pretty frequently now at events and meetings and in classes, but often we kind of hear a land acknowledgement and then move right into a lesson or into an event, and there's not necessarily like any action taken as a result of hearing a land acknowledgement, right? And today, since we're here to talk about food, we're going to be talking about food justice, food security, food sovereignty. I think it's especially important to be thinking about land within the context of food because all food does come from land, right? And so when we're thinking about our own relationships with food, we also then inherently need to be thinking about our relationship with land. So for example, like for me, I grew up in Toronto, I grew up in Scarborough and Malvern. And so I got most of my food like at the No Frills across the street. I wasn't growing my own produce. And so for me, I think it's really easy sometimes to just like go to the grocery store and completely forget that like this tomato that I'm going to be eating for dinner did come from land. Someone grew that from seed and now it's on my plate. And so as we're kind of talking about what food justice means, what food sovereignty means within the context of our food system, I just want us to kind of like center that relationship with land within that conversation. Okay, so this is my intro. It basically just goes over everything you already said, so I won't go over it again. But I am going to be talking specifically about my work with Foodshare today, as well as my work with Justice for Migrant Workers, which is a political collective that organizes for the rights of migrant farm workers. So those are the two things I'm going to focus on. But I do like to just kind of introduce myself because I think it's important, particularly within the context of doing work around food systems and work around like dismantling systems of oppression. It's important to talk about like who we are and where we exist within those systems as well, right? Okay, so I wanted to start with a bit of an interactive activity to kind of just like gauge where everyone's at around our knowledge around food insecurity and hunger here in Canada. So I'm gonna like read out a couple statements and I want folks to kind of just like yell out whether you think it's a myth or a fact, okay? So the first one is, hunger and food insecurity are not a problem here in Canada. Do we think that's false? False? Absolutely, yes. So I heard a lot of falses. It is absolutely a myth. Hunger very much is a problem here, as I'm sure we've all felt it in our own lives, especially like you said, with inflation and the increasing prices of produce. I think it's important to note that hunger is often framed as a problem that's pervasive elsewhere and not in Canada within like kind of like national media. We often talk about Canada being like this incredible like inclusive place where people can really like thrive. And this is very much the narrative that a lot of like newcomers will hear, right? Like my family, my dad immigrated from Jamaica, and there was like this idea that you would come to Canada and you would never struggle and there would always be food on your plate. And I think we all know that's not necessarily the case. But yeah, right now here in Toronto, 1 in 5 households experience food insecurity. And I will say that stat was from a couple years ago, so I do think it's actually increased at this point. What's that? Exactly, yes, with like the pandemic and inflation. Okay, so next up, here in Canada, everyone has the right to food. Do we think that's true or false? False? Yeah, so what I'm hearing from a lot of folks is that if we do have the right to food here in Canada, the question of how we can actually access that food is another question, which is true. So what I want to highlight here is that our government signed on to the UN Declaration on Human Rights. In that document, which is like international law, the right to food is embedded within that document. So our government chose to sign on to this UN covenant, which essentially said we as a state take responsibility for everyone living in Canada to have the right to food, right to housing, all of these things. So under like international law, Canada does as a state have responsibility to guarantee all of us, all of our right to food. I think based on what people have said, we obviously can see that that is not what they're actually doing. Not everyone has access to food. Not everyone is guaranteed that right to food. And if they are, the quality of that food, the cultural reflectiveness of that food, the price of that food, all of those things come into question as well. But I just want to highlight that like not every country signed on to this document, and that's really important to think about. So our state actively was like, we want to guarantee this for everyone living in Canada, whereas other so-called Western countries didn't sign on to it. So the US didn't sign on to this document. So they were like, we're not going to be responsible for that, whereas Canada opted into this. So this is like something to think about when we're considering how do we like advocate for change around our food system. This is something that we can use to hold our government accountable because it is like an actual policy document that exists in the world. Okay, so this is another true or false. So to guarantee people's right to food, our food system needs to produce more food. Do we think this is true or false?
Yes.
For sure. So I'm hearing some folks talk about food waste. I'm hearing some folks talk about what kind of food we're able to access versus, so like kind of this idea of quality over quantity. And so I think that is very accurate. So we don't actually need to produce more food. The global food system as it stands already produces enough food to feed 1.5 times the global population. Okay, and this statement I do want to clarify is referring to like the number of like nutritional like calories needed to be able to fuel everyone. This isn't referring to like the most like healthy food or like the most culturally diverse foods, but just generally, if we wanted to make sure that everyone was able to stay alive, we are currently producing more than enough food for that. So I think that what that says is that it's not actually about producing more, it's more about thinking about who can access food and where can you access it and where are these kind of like inequities within the system around accessing it. Okay, so to your point around food banks, is this true or false? Food banks and other emergency food aid programs, so like a drop-in center where you could get a meal or where you get like a hamper full of food, do those solve the problem of food insecurity? No. So I'm hearing a resounding no. That's amazing. I'm so glad we're on the same page about that. So food banking is very much a Band-Aid or like a temporary solution to a much deeper rooted problem, right? And I'm going to get into this a little bit later, so I won't focus on it too much right now. But generally, I think it's really important that we note that charity-based responses to food insecurity aren't sustainable, right? So when we're positioning food as this thing that we're giving people out of like the goodness of our hearts, that's really not kind of framing food as like a human right, which is how we should be framing it, right? So people shouldn't need to rely on something that's been framed as a handout. They should be able to access food on their own terms and with dignity, right? And we'll come back to this, so I don't want to sit on this for too long. Our food system currently frames food as a commodity and not a human right. Do folks agree with this, disagree with this, have questions? So very much the food system does prioritize profit over human rights, the way that our system is currently set up. So an example of this is in February of 2022, Loblaws reported its fourth quarter profit as being more than a double than a year before. Right? And this is the middle of a pandemic. This is when people are struggling to put food on the table, people are being laid off from their jobs, right? So just considering like how these kind of like corporate giants are really profiting off of the food system in Canada, in a place where everyone should be able to just like access food in a way that is equitable. Yeah, okay. So my next statement, and I want to know if folks think this is true or false, is Black households in Canada are almost 2 times more likely to be food insecure than white households. Do we think this is true or false? True, mostly? Yep. So this is very much true, and that number, the 2 times more likely, is when you adjust for all of the same kind of like whether or not you own your home or you rent, whether or not you have a job that pays like the same amount of money, the same level of education. Black people are still almost 2 times more likely to be food insecure than white people in the exact same situation as them. When you don't adjust for those factors and just do a comparison of white folks and Black folks in Canada, it's actually 3.5 times more likely to be food insecure. So I think this says a lot about the ways that our food system and our access to food is really tied into a lot of other systems that kind of shape the way we move through the world, right? And what that means is that certain people and certain communities are going to be more impacted by food insecurity than others. And it's not just Black folks, it's Indigenous folks, people living in certain lower income neighborhoods, queer folks, disabled folks. All of these people with intersecting identities are going to be more impacted by food insecurity, right? In the same way that we saw certain people more impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic. So just kind of like thinking about the way that intersectionality plays into this is really important because I think a lot of the time mainstream conversations about food insecurity and hunger don't necessarily highlight that certain people are experiencing it more than others. Okay, so this is a question I have for you. Do we think that the main reason why people have trouble accessing food is because they don't have jobs? No? Mostly no's? Okay. So you are right, that is absolutely false. 62% of food insecure households report that their main source of income is from wages or salaries from employment. So I think there's this kind of like widespread myth that people who are struggling to put food on the table for their families are lazy and don't have jobs, and that is very much just like a result of like this kind of neoliberal narrative around like you should be able to support your family. But at the end of the day, if 62% of people who are struggling to put food on the table are working, what that tells us is that wages are not enough, that we're having an issue with affordability in the city, right? It's not an issue of folks not actually working. So just thinking about that, and again, the connection to kind of broader systems, so thinking about structural poverty here and decent work. Okay, so I want us to take a minute to reflect on some of those statements that we just went over, consider kind of like what we thought going into that. Was there anything that surprised you out of those statements? So the reason that, it's really complex and there's many kind of like compounding factors, but the reason that Black folks are more likely to be food insecure than white folks in Canada is a result of systemic racism, systemic anti-Black racism that disadvantages Black folks at kind of every level of institution and government. So thinking about who has access to, like who gets hired for a job, who gets hired for a higher paying job, where folks are living, like what the socioeconomic opportunities look like in someone's neighborhood where they grew up. And I think that we can all agree that there's certain neighborhoods in Toronto, and we will get to this actually, there's certain neighborhoods that have generally lower incomes, right? If we look at the demographics, we also know that often those neighborhoods are more racialized neighborhoods, right? There's more Black folks, more Indigenous folks, more racialized folks in those neighborhoods, right? So those are two kind of like compounding factors. But there's like a lot of different levels of institutional and systemic racism that come into play that shape Black people's lives as they kind of move through the world. And within the food system, we could list a lot of different examples of anti-Black racism, but I think one kind of really clear example for me is, so like I said, I grew up in Malvern, which is a pretty Black neighborhood. It's a really diverse neighborhood, but I grew up in an area just across from Malvern Town Center, if anyone's familiar, and there's like a no frills there. And that grocery store has like security guards and metal detectors, and there's people who will like follow Black folks around in the grocery store. If you go to another neighborhood that has less Black folks, you're not gonna see the same levels of security. You're not gonna see baby food locked up behind bars. You're gonna have folks who are like greeting you at the door instead of following you around the grocery store, right? And so just thinking about the ways that security, surveillance, policing, all of these things affect Black people's relationships with food as they move through the world is like just one very specific example of why that's the case, but there's a plethora of other ones that you could kind of look at. And I just want to come back to this kind of, like mentioning that like all racialized people are experiencing like heightened policing, heightened surveillance, more food insecurity, and that's absolutely true. But like I said, there are kind of like levels and different like intersectionalities. And so specifically with anti-Black racism, it is tied into the transatlantic slave trade and the roots that has here in Canada. So we need to kind of like be cognizant of the way that specifically Black folks and Indigenous folks, because of settler colonialism, are even more likely to experience those things. And we can look at kind of like broader histories that we can tie that extra surveillance to for Black folks in Canada if we look at things like carding that the Toronto Police Services does, right? So TPS will stop Black folks in the street, ask them for their ID. And there's been tons and tons of studies done on why it's almost always Black folks who get stopped and not other people. And with Indigenous folks, we could look at things like the pass system where Indigenous people weren't allowed to leave reserves without having passes, right? And so there's a history of the Canadian state monitoring, surveilling, watching, policing Black and Indigenous bodies, and also many other racialized folks, but just important to kind of like understand that anti-Black racism and settler colonialism are like an added level to just systemic racism as well. Okay, so I want us to just look at a couple numbers of food insecurity across Canada. So 1 in 5 households in Toronto experience food insecurity. 62% of Canadians who experience food insecurity have jobs. 78% of households reliant on social assistance are food insecure. So that would be folks on like OW, ODSP. 28.2% of Indigenous households are food insecure. 28.9% of Black households are food insecure. 12.4% of white children live in food insecure households, while 36.6% of Black children live in food insecure households. There was a 600% increase in calls to 211 for emergency food relief during COVID-19. Disabled folks experience food insecurity at rates 3 times higher than non-disabled people. Bisexual Canadians are 3 times more likely to be food insecure than heterosexual Canadians. And renters make up the majority of food insecure households. Okay, so I know these are a lot of different numbers, a lot of different it's a long list. But I just want us to, first of all, take a moment to recognize that these are not just numbers, these are very much people's lives and lived experiences. So I'm not just showing us these numbers for no reasons. But what I want us to, or my question for you all is, what are some different systems or structures of oppression and power that we're seeing show up in these people's experiences, right? So I talked a little bit already about structural poverty. And we can see that in the fact that people who are working can't afford food. We can see that in the fact that people reliant on social assistance can't afford food, can't put food on the table. So that is a result of structural poverty. I talked a little bit about anti-Black racism. We see that showing up in the fact that 28.9% of Black households are food insecure. So do y'all see any other kind of systems or structures at play here that you think are factoring into people's experiences, shaping their relationships with food? Okay, so here is my list of just some. So like I mentioned, systemic racism. This is a very ominous slide. Systemic racism, anti-Black racism, settler colonialism, structural poverty, ableism, homophobia. There's many different systems intersecting. Basically, what I want us to kind of take away from this is just the fact that people's relationships with food, the way that people are going to access food, is shaped by all of these different systems that shape the way that we kind of move through the world, right? And based on what we look like, who we are, where we come from, how we live, all of these things, we're all moving through the world in really different ways. And so our relationships with accessing food are all going to be really different depending on the ways that our different identities intersect, right? And we're going to just quickly look at Regent Park specifically, since that's where we are. So since we know that there are certain communities, certain groups, certain populations who are more likely to experience food insecurity, I want us to look specifically at what our community looks like in Regent Park, right? And so if we look at, and this is all from StatsCan, these statistics. Number of low-income households in Regent Park was 44.4%, whereas the rest of Toronto was 21.9%. Renter households, so people who rent as opposed to owning a home, that was at close to 75% in Regent Park, and closer to 47% across the rest of the city. Seniors living alone, so we do know that seniors who are experiencing isolation are more likely to experience food insecurity. And here in Regent Park, 42% of the population versus the rest of Toronto, 26%. BIPOC population, so that's racialized people generally. In Regent Park, 70% of the population is racialized, whereas the rest of Toronto, only about 50% is racialized. And then finally, Indigenous folks here in Regent Park, 2%, whereas the rest of Toronto, 0.9%, so double almost. So I just want us to think about the fact that all of these kind of factors make someone more likely to experience food insecurity. And so if we're thinking, I couldn't find specific statistics around food insecurity in Regent Park, but I think what we can understand based on this, based on knowing who lives here, what the community looks like, we know that folks are more likely to be susceptible to food insecurity in Regent Park as a result of who is living here. And yeah, just to the point around Indigenous folks, like you said, it's often underrepresented, but I think what we can look at is the ratio of folks reported in Regent Park versus folks reported across the city. So like you said, there is a higher concentration of Indigenous folks living here. Whether it's just 2% is, remains to be seen. But we do know that there's a higher number of folks living here. Okay. So I wanted to just kind of briefly go over some terms that I've been using and will continue to use while I speak. So the first one is food insecurity. Does anyone have like a loose definition of how they would define food insecurity? Okay, so it is often commonly defined as the state of being without reliable access to a sufficient quantity of affordable, nutritious food as a result of broader systems of oppression, right? So kind of like what we were talking about at the beginning, it's not just about the quantity of food, but it's also about the quality of food, what the food is, whether it's the food that you want to eat, right? So food charity, when I use the term food charity, I'm referring to an approach to responding to food insecurity that looks at kind of this immediate need through the distribution of emergency food. So examples would be food banks, drop-in centers, and these kind of places where folks can go and get food for the next couple of days, not necessarily food for the rest of their lives, right? And then finally, food justice. Food justice is an approach to food insecurity that recognizes its root causes and seeks to dismantle systemic forms of oppression that exist in our food system, right? So basically what I mean by this is that it is impossible to talk about food or food insecurity without talking about all of these broader systems that it's connected to. So kind of when you were asking, like, so what's the solution? The solution is not just to think about food in isolation, but to think about how all these other factors are coming into play, right? We can't talk about food without talking about wages, without talking about the minimum wage and what that is, right, versus a living wage. We can't talk about food without talking about policing in grocery stores and how that can lead to often like a lot of youth's first interaction with police in grocery stores, right, out of food insecurity. So like there's all of these kind of like bigger connections that we need to make. So there's not just one solution, but rather many changes that need to happen at the systemic level for us to have a truly like food just world. Okay, so I just wanted to kind of like talk briefly about the differences between food charity and food justice. So food charity programs like food banks, drop-in meals, et cetera, that provide emergency access to food. Food charity initiatives often frame food insecurity as a charitable cause that requires handouts. So I will say the first food bank in Canada, does anyone want to guess when it was opened? 10 years ago, I heard. Any other guesses? 20 years ago? Over 20 years, 25 years? Colonialism started. That's a good. What's that? So the first official food bank started in 1981 in Alberta, and it started as a result of like an economic recession. People were struggling to be able to feed their families, so a bunch of different like kind of community groups got together and they decided they were going to help feed their neighbors by providing like emergency food relief. I think the two answers around like colonialism, really important to think about too, because food banks very much have roots in like settler colonial relations, in like Christian efforts to kind of like give out food out of churches. Like they're rooted in those things, but officially the first one opened in 1981. And what makes it problematic about the fact that it's rooted in these kind of like settler colonial systems is that it's often framed as this kind of like, I don't know if folks are like familiar with like this idea of the white savior, but like it often in a lot of food banks, not every food bank, a lot of food banks kind of replicate this idea that like wealthy settler white folks can come in and give out food as like, I'm doing this out of the goodness of my heart and I'm helping you, as opposed to framing food as like, everybody should have access to this and I'm not doing this as like an act of kindness, but rather this should be like something that you can access, yeah. And as a result of the way that like food bank volunteers or food bank staff are interacting with people, right? And that is very much, again, rooted in this idea that they're this like notion that they're the helper, they're better than the person that they're helping, right? Which goes back, ties into like these settler colonial dynamics, these Christian dynamics. And also, we could also, like kind of going back to the conversation around policing, In food banks, there's all these like eligibility requirements, and you're required to like show up with a lot of paperwork and ID and like proof of address and all of these things that make it really hard for people to access food and make it really stigmatizing for people to go into that space and have to feel like they're kind of being scrutinized when they're just showing up to be able to put food on the table, right? So all of that to say, I do want to say like, I recognize that we do need food banks right now, right? I'm not saying food banks are bad and we should not have food banks. I recognize that they're a very like necessary measure at this point in time based on kind of like the society that we live in here in Toronto. But when I talk about food justice and when I talk about like what my hopes are, what Foodshare's hopes are, it's kind of like this move towards building systems, building structures where we won't need food banks anymore, where people won't need to go and line up a food bank to get their food, but rather they can go to a store, buy their own food, go grow their own food if they want, you know? Like being able to access food with dignity is a really important part of food security and food justice. It's not just about the like access piece, but actually how we can access that food, right? And so when we talk about food justice, it's often characterized by community-led initiatives that are bottom up rather than top down. So I think Regent Park is a really good example of a place, of a neighborhood where there are a lot of community-driven initiatives, where residents have taken the lead because residents are the people who know what they need, right? Like someone who lives in a community is gonna know best what that community needs. And so when we're talking about a food justice approach to food insecurity, it should be led by the folks who are the experts on that, and those are the people experiencing that thing, right? It also looks at tackling barriers to inequitable access to food. So I feel like if we look at food banks, it's kind of addressing the symptoms of the problem rather than the actual conditions that are breeding that problem, right? And when we're talking about food justice, we're talking about initiatives that are looking at those systemic barriers and thinking about how are we going to dismantle those barriers? How are we going to make this more equitable? So it's also framing food as a human right instead of as this commodity, and focusing on making long-term changes and transforming systems. And this last bullet point I think is a really important one, because like I was saying earlier, when we talk about food, when we talk about food security, we often get bogged down in this idea that food justice must just like have to do with food policy itself. But food justice is talking about affordable housing. Food justice is talking about like accessible childcare for everyone, right? Because all of these different factors are playing into whether we have enough money in our pocket to go to the grocery store and buy food, right? And then food justice is also talking about like government regulations around grocery stores and like inflation and things like that. And so when we talk about food justice, there's like all of these different pieces of the puzzle that we need to put together to create like a truly just food system. Okay, and then food sovereignty is a term that comes up often, so I just wanted to touch on it briefly. Often, like, I've seen a lot of like infographics that will kind of like lay out, it'll be like food security, food justice, and then food sovereignty. So kind of like as they get more radical, that's like the scale. So I'm just gonna read this kind of like quote. It's a definition of food sovereignty. So food sovereignty is the right of peoples to healthy and culturally appropriate food produced through ecologically sound and sustainable methods, and their right to define their own food and agriculture systems. It puts the aspirations and needs of those who produce, distribute, and consume food at the heart of food systems and policies, rather than the demands of markets and corporations. So food sovereignty initiatives focus on dismantling regimes and creating politically enabling conditions for equitable food systems. Food sovereignty as a term was coined by La Via Campesina, which is an indigenous peoples movement from all over like the so-called global south, like all across kind of South America, Latin America, and all over Africa as well. So it was kind of like driven by indigenous farmers across the world, and they coined this term food sovereignty, which is now used very frequently to describe kind of like what many indigenous groups are pushing for. So indigenous food sovereignty is a big one. Black food sovereignty is also a big kind of like movement at the moment. Toronto actually is the first North American city to fund a Black food sovereignty plan at the municipal level. So our government has actually put money into funding like more land access for Black farmers in Toronto, like funding, if anyone's been to the like Little Jamaica Farmers Market, like that's funded by the city as well. So it's exciting that Toronto's the first place that has this in the world. But yeah, so when we're talking about kind of like the connections between food justice and food sovereignty, they very much are connected. I would say food justice is kind of just like, have folks ever seen that photo of it's like equity, like, those people standing on, looking over a, yeah, so if we think about kind of like food security, food justice, food sovereignty, it's like that diagram, where it's like food sovereignty is just taking a step further what food justice is. And it's about like completely transforming a system, whereas I think food justice is more looking at like, what are policy changes, what are like changes we can make? Food sovereignty is like, let's build a whole new system. So they can kind of work in tandem, and that's what they do. So Foodshare, we're a food justice nonprofit. We advocate for the right to food and work to challenge the systemic barriers that keep people from accessing the food they need to thrive. We support urban farms across the city. We subsidize local produce markets and are currently campaigning for a new Toronto food charter, which is what I'm going to talk about in this specific example. So I'm going to skip over this. Everyone will, I think, get the slides afterwards. So you can, awesome. So you can like take a look at these if you want to kind of understand from like an organization's perspective how we would implement like food justice values into our work. But just for the sake of time, I'm going to skip over this right now. But this just kind of goes over our vision, our mission, and our values as an organization. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about an example of like a practical way that we've been working on implementing food justice in our work. So we've been running a Right to Food campaign at Foodshare. So in October 2021, Foodshare launched our Right to Food campaign, which is a citywide advocacy initiative calling for a new Toronto food charter. So the Toronto Food Charter is a document, a policy document that was adopted in 2001 by Toronto City Council. And it is the document that guides all of the like municipal level spending around food policy in Toronto. It was written by city councillors at the time, not with a lot of consultation from communities. So it was very much just shaped by a couple politicians who hadn't necessarily experienced food insecurity themselves. And it has not been updated since 2001. So this document hasn't been updated in over 20 years, and it is the policy document that is the only one we have to guide our municipal spending on food stuff. So in line with our kind of like advocating for food as a right across the city, what we've started is this Right to Food campaign to rewrite the Toronto Food Charter, to update it to actually be reflective of like what food insecurity looks like in Toronto in 2023, and have it be shaped by communities who actually are experiencing food insecurity every day across the city. So we called on the city to, first of all, support the development of a new Toronto Food Charter written by marginalized communities who are most affected by food insecurity to reflect their needs. This requires centering the leadership of people who experience the most food insecurity, which is specifically Black, Indigenous, and racialized people, people with disabilities, workers, and renters. 2, include a mechanism for the new Toronto Food Charter to ensure that the city is accountable to the communities impacted by its food policies. So a lot of the time we see when we push for policy changes, we might get like a new document or a new statement written, but thinking about how we're actually going to hold the government accountable to that document is like the second part of the question, right? So like once we get them to rewrite the food charter, how are we going to be checking in to make sure that they've actually made progress on the things that are called for in that document? And 3, the most, maybe arguably the most important thing, ensure that the city is allocating sufficient funding and resources to realize the right to food in Toronto. So again, we could ask them to write a new food charter, we could come up with an accountability mechanism, but if the city isn't actually investing money in making changes, we're not really going to see anything be transformed, right? So these were our 3 calls. And this is kind of like the timeline of the campaign itself. So in October 2021, we launched the campaign, which included an event with community leaders from across the city who were working like at St. Jamestown Community Co-op, Indigenous food sovereignty leaders from across the city, Black food sovereignty leaders from across the city. And we had this kind of event to launch this citywide campaign that we were running. That included also we did some like postering around the city. We had a like kind of big social media blitz with information about the right to food, about the Toronto Food Charter. In March 2022, as a result of like this social media campaign that we'd been running, Councillor Joe Cressy brought forward a motion to update the Toronto Food Charter. So he brought that to City Council as a result of these advocacy efforts. And in April 2022, the motion to update the food charter was approved by the Toronto City Council. So that was like a really great first step. The advocacy from communities, getting people to kind of like engage in social media, send emails, sign petitions, all that good stuff, did end up in kind of like some action on the City Council side. And so the next step in kind of like making real change is thinking about like, so now we've gotten them to agree to rewrite this document. How are we gonna shape that document into something that actually reflects what communities want and need, right? And who are the experts and how do we ensure that their voices are reflected in that document? So we've started by we held a food justice art exhibit, which was an interactive art exhibit online where folks could go in and add their own ideas about what the right to food should look like in Toronto, what the Toronto Food Charter should look like. We had an in-person exhibit as well at one of our urban farms in Flemo, which is the Flemo Community Farm, if anyone's had a chance to visit that. But since then, we've also been running a ton of like community-based workshops, partnering with different kind of like community-based organizations to work with residents in various neighborhoods of Toronto to kind of get their feedback on like, what would a Toronto Food Charter look like to you that actually reflects the needs of like you and your community and your family. So this is very much still ongoing work. We're at the very beginning of this kind of process because unfortunately, enacting policy, even at the municipal level, takes a really, really long time. There's a lot of red tape, a lot of kind of obstacles to overcome, but we're in this like kind of process of working with city staff, particularly staff in the SDFA unit of the city, to kind of like have this ongoing dialogue around like, how are we gonna rewrite this? What community consultation is gonna be involved? And how can we, Foodshare, as like this nonprofit that works with many communities across the city, help engage folks to ensure that voices are actually being reflected in this new document that will be passed by City Council eventually. These were just like some examples of little sticky notes that people put up at our art exhibit. But yeah, this is one example. So this is like a very kind of like policy-based advocacy example of what can be done, right? So this is specifically looking at like, what are the policies in place? How can we look at like a formal process of rewriting a specific policy and what do we need to do to push for that policy to be rewritten? So it's a very kind of like it's working within an institution, right? It's not like applying a bunch of pressure from the outside. It's not like a radical grassroots thing that's happening. It's a very much like, how are we working within the system that already exists to update a policy that can better reflect our needs and wants as community members. So I'll talk briefly about Justice for Migrant Workers because I wanted to give you a kind of different perspective on another way that like food justice work happens on the ground. So Justice for Migrant Workers, or J4MW, is a volunteer-run political collective comprising of people from diverse walks of life, including migrant workers themselves, as well as former migrant farmer workers, labor organizers, educators, researchers, students, and racialized youth. We're based in Toronto, and basically we strive to promote the rights of migrant farm workers and farm workers without formal immigration status across Canada and the US. It's important to say that this work is very much like transnational in its scope, because of the way that the seasonal agricultural worker program functions here in Canada. So maybe just like quickly a show of hands, who's heard of the seasonal agricultural worker program? I see like 3 or 4 people. So for those of you who aren't familiar, the seasonal agricultural worker program is a labor program at the federal level. So it's like a Canadian national program. We partner with, I believe, 12 countries at the moment, mostly in like the Caribbean and Latin America, for folks to be able to come over to Canada to work on farms across Canada. Workers come through the program and are tied to a single employer. So if they're unhappy in their workplace, they don't have labor mobility. They can't go to another workplace, which is like illegal under international law to not have labor mobility. They come for up to 10 months at a time, and often workers return for like 20 years at a time. They'll spend like the majority of their adult lives in Canada working on farms. They're not covered under the Employment Standards Act here in Ontario, so they aren't guaranteed a minimum wage. They aren't guaranteed a certain number of like break hours or break time during their workday. They often are like Black, Brown, and Indigenous folks as a result of the countries that they are coming in from. And they're going to work on these farms, like I mentioned earlier, that are like these big corporate farms, right? So it's not like they're coming to work for like a family-owned farm where it's like a community. They're very much working in like plantation-style dynamics, unfortunately, at the end of the day. And many workers are actually forced to live on the farms that they're working on. And they're forced to live in really like deplorable housing conditions in these bunk houses. There'll be like 30, 40 men living in a bunk house with maybe like 1 or 2 shared washrooms. They segregate them based on the countries that they're coming from. And on the actual like work site, there'll be like an employer bathroom and a worker bathroom, which essentially translates to like a whites and racialized bathroom. So segregation very much well and alive within the context of this program. And so what Justice for Migrant Workers does is we work with migrant workers themselves to think about how can we transform this program to make it more equitable for the workers. Because I think one really important thing to note within the context of the SAWP is that workers don't want to abolish this program. They want to continue coming back, but they want to be coming back to working conditions that are like decent work conditions. They want to live in nice housing, and they want to be able to access status if that's something that they want to do. Because right now, if you come in through this program, you can't immigrate to Canada. There are no pathways to be able to immigrate, even if you've come for 25 years in a row. So you always have temporary status. And so in terms of like what workers want, they just want decent working conditions, and they want the option to be able to immigrate in the future if that is what they would like. Say a lot of people don't know about this program. It's very like well kind of hidden in terms of like how we talk about the Canadian agricultural system and the food system generally. A lot of people don't know where our produce comes from, where our food comes from, even though you can drive like Leamington is a town. It's the tomato capital of North America. It's 3 hours away from here. So all of that is to say, and like you kind of said, during the COVID-19 pandemic, at the beginning of it, workers were hit extremely hard. And we heard that from them. So the COVID-19 pandemic disproportionately impacted migrant farm workers across Ontario. There were massive COVID-19 outbreaks on farms that led to many workers dying as a result of a lack of safety protocols on the farms and in the bunk houses that they were living in. Workers were also forced to quarantine for 2 weeks. And during those 2 weeks, they didn't have access to culturally reflective or nutritionally appropriate foods. So we were getting a lot of photos sent to us from workers who were receiving food from their employers, and it would be like a child-sized portion of like chicken and rice for workers who might not eat meat. There might be pork for people who need like halal food. So it was like not culturally relevant or nutritionally appropriate at all. There was also an increase in the surveillance and control of workers' bodies. So like there was like a lot of surveillance around like some workers got deported for trying to leave the farm to go buy their own groceries. So we heard from workers that there was action needed in 2 areas. The first was food itself. So workers were receiving inadequate rations from employers. so they were essentially telling us as like a collective that we needed to figure out a way to get emergency food to them that was actually like culturally relevant and the food that they wanted to eat. And second of all, they were asking for public awareness. So like we just discussed, a lot of people don't know that this program exists. A lot of people don't know there are migrant farm workers just an hour away in Niagara. And the conditions on the farms were getting worse every day, but no one really knew about it. So workers wanted the collective to kind of come up with a way to draw public awareness to the fact that this was happening. So in response to this, we kind of had a multi-pronged approach to what workers were asking for, what they needed. One of those things was providing emergency food drop-offs to them. So we had someone within our collective create like a WhatsApp kind of group with workers at different farms and take grocery orders every week. And we would go and physically like buy, like 20 red snappers or whatever they were looking for to go drop off in Leamington, and we would drive it over to them along with like culturally appropriate like produce like fruits and veg. So that was one part of it. We also thought about the fact that, I talked earlier about food charity and how food charity doesn't actually like change things in the long term. And so for us, we wanted to make sure that we weren't just doing food charity. We weren't just dropping food off and then leaving. So we wanted to think about like, how do we tie dropping this food off into like this broader thing around public education and awareness? So we actually like arranged multiple caravans where we would drive through the towns where workers were living to drop the food off to them with like signs, banners, having speakers at the events to kind of draw attention to the fact that there were farm workers just like 10 minutes outside of where people were living. And then the biggest kind of public education piece that we had was a social media campaign that we ran. So we ran a multi-week kind of social media campaign leading up to a digital day of action. So this was while everyone was still in lockdown. We couldn't gather publicly. It wasn't safe to do so. So we organized a digital day of action where we had everyone log onto Zoom at the same time to take kind of like a coordinated effort to pressure different levels of government to make changes to protect migrant workers. So we built this really...
Network, right?
What's that?
Migrant worker network. There's a group owned, I believe.
Yeah, there's quite a few, yeah. But we wrote a kind of toolkit that we shared with folks, and we had like over 100 people join on Zoom, and we essentially spent the hour, or it was 2 hours, and the first hour was speakers, so we had migrant workers themselves kind of speak, share with folks about what was going on, and the second hour we went into breakout rooms, into smaller groups, and had facilitators lead people through a number of different actions where everyone could kind of just like do them together. Because I know sometimes it can be a bit nerve-wracking to like write an email to your counselor or to call a politician. You might not know what to say, you might not know what to ask for, and so we wrote scripts. We wrote email scripts, we wrote phone scripts, we wrote tweet scripts so that people could kind of walk through each action we wanted them to take to target kind of like the federal, provincial, and municipal levels of government on making changes to protect workers in that moment. Yeah, that was it.
Thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Also follow us on social media, and for more information, check out our website.